In 1991, Sonic the Hedgehog showed the world that games could go fast. Very fast. And that going fast could be the whole purpose behind a game. This set off a decade-long arms race, as other games tried to capture and improve on that sensation. First, there was Nintendo, launching their Super Console that fall with F-Zero, taking the spirit of speed where it rightfully belongs, onto the racetrack. A few years later, at the launch of the PlayStation, Psygnosis would grace that system with its own version of this premise, but now in 3D. That famous game would be Wipeout, which set the bar for quality pretty high for any imitators that followed. On top of that, there were the technical difficulties at getting such primitive 3D consoles to draw polygons fast enough to simulate real speed. Wipeout would stand tall above the rest for a few years, but it only came to the PlayStation and the Saturn. It was here that the ambitious and opportunistic publisher Acclaim saw an opening, since they were close partners with Nintendo, and even one of the company's hand-picked members of their Nintendo 64 Dream Team of publishers. So about a year after the Nintendo 64 came to market in North America, Acclaim released a game called Extreme G. This was a futuristic motorbike racing game that focused on one thing and one thing over all others: speed. Extreme G, at that point in time, made its claim to fame as possibly the fastest game on any console, thanks to the Nintendo 64's overwhelming ability to throw around polygons compared to its contemporaries. But this came at the expense of draw distance, as the game had an equally overwhelming close-distance fog effect, and drew fairly simplistic models at close range. Still, it was an impressive demonstration of speed, and even pumped out a 4-player split-screen mode, meaning the N64 had to render the same thing 4 times at once. For that first year, Acclaim had the jump on the competition, since it was out a year ahead of any competing titles on the N64. The following year, however, Acclaim would not be so lucky, as the Wipeout series would finally arrive on the Nintendo 64, with Wipeout 64, and Nintendo would lay down the law with its own famously fast F-Zero X. Since the second game, Extreme G2, would be iterating on a prior game, there would be an implicit need to improve on the shortcomings of the previous title. And they did, with much more detailed and textured environments and much better draw distances, all while speeding up the action even further and making far more complex levels. The problem was, this appeared to be flying too close to the sun, as the frame rate became a major problem for this game, and the controls became close to unusable, as they fluctuated between either mired in the slowdown problems, or, when things were at full speed, they were actually too fast to realistically react to what was coming at the player. This was particularly caused by the more complex level design, which set up paths that were too tight, twisted, and winding to navigate at such high speeds, causing the player to bounce off the walls with frustratingly high frequencies. It was a jumping the shark moment for this particular subgenre. They had made a game that went too fast for someone to reliably play. Plus, now Acclaim's effort was up against the original titans in this genre. Wipeout 64 wasn't as fast or as graphically splashy as Extreme G2, but it kept up a very solid frame rate while rendering a nice futuristic environment. While F-Zero X took the route of foregoing a very detailed environment at all, in favor of a very high 60 frames per second frame rate, which was virtually unheard of in that era of early 3D games, when most struggled to get out of the 20 frames per second range. The result of all this was that Extreme G2 was regarded as a major stumble for a fledgling new series that effectively allowed its bigger competitors to stomp it out, at least for the time being. Seeing as how their game was largely being hamstrung by the technical limitations of the current crop of consoles, of which the N64 was the most powerful, the series went into hibernation for a bit, until the next generation of consoles came around. The next game would also move to a new studio within Acclaim's internal family of developers. Although physically it would not move far. It passed from Acclaim's London-based studio, formerly known as Probe Entertainment, over to a newly founded Acclaim Studios Cheltenham, just a short distance away within the UK. This new development house was actually founded by former members of Psygnosis, the other UK-based developer that still stood as the undisputed leader of the futuristic fast racing genre with its Wipeout franchise. This new studio would hit the ground running straight away on the next-generation systems, being the studio that was responsible for porting Sega's Crazy Taxi to the PS2 and GameCube. In an interview with the studio head Harvey Elliott, he stated that work on Extreme G3 actually started in April of 1999. The unspoken fact here is that it would have begun once Acclaim got its PlayStation 2 development kits, and this would be the first game in the series to release on a non-Nintendo platform. But it wouldn't be publicly seen until 2001, when it got its unveiling at E3 2001, with a near final beta version being shown. Those who reported on it remarked that the game appeared to be the final realization of what the Extreme G series was trying to achieve on the N64. With large, well-designed, stylish, futuristic cities laid out all the way to the horizon. The distance fog was finally gone. More importantly, this was all running at a full 60 frames per second. But this was a preview of the PlayStation 2 version. The GameCube version wasn't shown yet. A few weeks later, after the show, Acclaim would make one consolation announcement for eager Nintendo fans by revealing that the GameCube version of the game would one-up the PlayStation 2 version by pushing out a full 4-player multiplayer mode, as opposed to the PS2's 2-player-only mode. Aside from this, word would be relatively tight until the game got closer to launch. It was originally slated for the GameCube's original November 5th launch date, but once that launch date was pushed back by Nintendo, it seems that Extreme G3 got its own minor delay, falling behind the new launch date and becoming one of the first games to ship after the GameCube's launch on November 27th, 2001, the same day Electronic Arts was shipping its GameCube port of SSX Tricky. Extreme G3 opens with a fairly generic but high-quality movie sequence, giving you the dramatic angles of what your gravity-defying super speed racing looks like when pre-rendered. From there it takes you to the main menu screen, and the influence of a team that worked on the Wipeout series becomes immediately clear, since the visual style of the menu is a pretty noticeable break from the previous two games. The first game used basic block shapes to present its menu options, while the second went with the Wheel of Options method. This game opens with the same kind of sleek, clean, yet abstract, mock-futuristic symbols for each of the menu items that were another well-known design element of the Wipeout series, particularly the most recent game at that time, Wipeout 3. The game modes are simple and straightforward, with a career mode that you can either start from scratch in or load progress from, an arcade mode that lets you race the tracks that you've unlocked, and the options menu. The options are equally simple, with a credit sequence, the audio settings, which lets you turn on Dolby Surround Sound, a nice touch, and a control section, which actually lets you customize all of the buttons, something most games back then didn't allow you to do, although it's largely taken for granted today. The arcade mode lets you have some immediate fun with the whole arsenal of weapons unlocked, but only a few tracks available. Still, it's probably best to start here just to get a handle on everything and learn the tracks before heading into the career mode. Whether you start in the arcade or the career mode, once you fire up one of the levels, you can see that Acclaim and the development team spared no time or expense in working on an absolute marvel of a graphics engine, with vast landscapes or cityscapes laid out in well-deserved promotional panning shots before the race begins. No fog to be seen anywhere, all rendered with remarkably smooth anti-aliasing and nicely detailed textures. Some good effects, like transparent water, are also in the mix, while all running at a very consistent 60 frames per second. It's actually one of the best looking GameCube games we've seen thus far, aside from Rogue Squadron 2, of course. Although racing games are almost cheating when it comes to graphical splendor, since by definition they take place on a set track, so there's plenty of leeway for the hardware to throw around beautifully planned and sculpted environments, since the player won't be able to run around them in a 3D world and approach them from any angle, only the ones that you can reach on the narrow racetrack. Still, not all racing games go beyond the minimum, or sometimes make the choice between detail and frame rate. This game doesn't have to make any of those choices, and has beautifully thought out and well-designed levels from an artistic perspective. Like the menus, they're aesthetically pleasing, futuristic 3D paintings of a world imagined, the kind of brighter, more advanced future still in the minds of developers when this game was made in the Y2K era, before the post-apocalypse era of gritty pessimism took over most art forms. With the power of a new generation of hardware, the Extreme G series was finally able to realize the original vision that they had never had a chance to achieve on the Nintendo 64. Another thing that a new team and a clean slate was able to do to achieve the original vision of this little franchise was to carefully consider and design the layout of the levels and tracks to avoid the bouncing off the walls or impossibly quick split-decision turns that marred the second game. In fact, the interview with the studio head, Harvey Elliott, revealed that each track took about 6 months to build, as they were carefully made to make sure they would be drivable and maneuverable without being too linear. Above all, the team wanted to avoid the setbacks of the earlier games and make sure this one was above all playable before any other considerations. This sounds obvious for game development until you remember the earlier experience with the first 2 games, focusing on the speed, the graphics, or the complexity to the detriment of the ability to play the game. The focus on reasonable drivable levels is evident from your very first playing, since the first available level is a very simple round track with long straightaways, and all the ones that follow evolve from that. On top of that, the controls and handling of the bikes in the game are significantly different than previous iterations. The bikes are given much heavier and more grounded handling than the first 2 games, taking away the very twitchy, quick reacting directional moves that made losing control and bouncing off the walls so much more prevalent. The gameplay itself is also very straightforward. You race. Wait for that countdown timer at the beginning, and hit the gas to propel yourself forward. After a short amount of time into the first lap, your extra powers will come online and you can engage either the boost function to take your bike up to ludicrous speeds, or use the weapons to try and take aim and blow your enemies away. There's also colored stripes along each side of the track at certain intervals to give you the chance to recharge either of these functions, as they both have limited capacity. Like we discussed with some of Acclaim's launch titles, XG3 contains everything needed to consider it a complete game, and absolutely nothing more. There's no bells or whistles here, no new ideas or creative new modes. You have the arcade version of the game, letting you race a single race, and then you have the career mode, which lets you get some semblance of progression by earning money as you win races in order to upgrade your vehicles with faster engines, better weapons, and more shields. You can earn money by completing the regular tournaments, or earning a high score in the time trial mode. Aside from those 2 modes, there's also a practice mode, so you can just get the hang of the tracks that you have available to you, the function to save your progress, and the store for purchasing those upgrades to your vehicle. And that's all she wrote when it comes to XG3. It's got just what it's supposed to have in order to be a complete racing game package and not 1 inch more. If fast, futuristic speed racing is the kind of genre you enjoy, it's definitely worth picking it up and giving it a go. It's a solid, beautiful, well-crafted implementation of that genre. If you're not a big fan on racing games of any variety, and racing the same tracks over and over to get better and better taxes your patience, you're probably better off staying away here. But XG3 at least is a perfect demonstration of the fact that with this new generation of consoles, the original blueprints and dreams of the polygonal 3D era were finally becoming fully realized. The limitations of the early days had been overcome, and anything was now possible.